Excellent. All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming, and thanks very much to Allison, our speaker, had to deal with traffic and the joys of parking at Carleton, the rush here. So I'm delighted to introduce a friend and a colleague from Queen's University, Allison Goebel, who teaches in the Environmental Studies program, trained as a sociologist, I think.
Yes.
At University of Alberta, and did her research in Zimbabwe for doctoral research, and then the last maybe 10 or so years, a bit more working in South Africa. And this is a brand new book out, their second book with McGill Queen's University Press, On Their Own: Women, Urbanization, and the Right to the City in South Africa, which she's not only going to give us a lecture about today, but then we also have books courtesy of Lisa and Octopus Books, which I know I'm looking forward to buying it. I know Allison will be happy to autograph in them as well. Exactly. Just before turning it over to Allison, some of you know already, I'm Rutherford Institute of African Studies. We have a lot of events going on, which we organize with both ourselves and with other organizations. If you're interested in African studies topics more broadly, we have a listserv that goes out once a week with information about upcoming events in the Ottawa-Gatineau area, not only here, but U of O, put on by NGOs, put on by community groups, everything from fundraisers to talks to conferences, films, and so forth. So I'll put our list around, feel free to put your name on it. And one of the events coming up in a couple of weeks is part of our monthly Brown Bag series, and it's by my colleague, friend, Monica Patterson, who teaches in child studies here, who's going to give a talk on troubling tropes, the African child in colonial postcards of the early 1900s, which is on November 18th, 2 weeks today exactly, same room, same time, 1 o'clock in the History Lounge. Without further ado, though, I turn over to Allison.
Okay, thanks so much, and thanks to Blair for the invitation, and thanks to Octopus Books for coming out with some of the books. I thought I'd start with just a little bit of background in terms of how this project developed and just some of the kind of overview information. And then we'll go through some of the specifics in terms of the research on women and urbanizing South Africa. And then I'd like to just kind of point to some of the bigger themes or bigger questions that the book tries to grapple with. And I'd really like to have a discussion so we can take the discussion any direction that people are interested in the room. So this project began really, more than 10 years ago when I started working in South Africa with a team with the University of KwaZulu-Natal on a project called Urban Ecosystems and Human Health in South Africa. And in that project, we were looking at the rapidly urbanizing context in South Africa. We think about it as post-apartheid, post-1994, but really it was really starting in the late 80s and early 90s as the apartheid era laws against migrating into cities started to be relaxed. They weren't repealed until later, but people were starting to come into cities even in the late 80s and early 90s, but that really started to ramp up again post-1994 with the transition to democratic government. I was just listening to the swearing-in ceremony of our own government here on the radio all the way up. So that was the context, and we were interested in looking at issues around housing, especially for low-income people. So we've got this rapid urbanization happening, people coming in from rural areas, and so how are cities coping with that in terms of all of the housing, the infrastructure, other kinds of services, water, electricity, and so on and so forth, that if you can imagine, many cities in South Africa, including our case study city of Pietermaritzburg, or Mzanduzi as it's now known, tripled in size. And you can just imagine any city, even in a wealthy country like ours, in Canada, how would you as a municipal government, and even as a national government, deal with that kind of rapid and extensive population growth that you're now responsible for in terms of delivering sewage, water, electricity, and so forth. So that was the context we were looking at, and we wanted to ask questions specifically about housing for low-income people, as well as how that might link to issues of health in urbanizing populations, as well as what are the environmental impacts, issues, considerations, and so on and so forth. So in that early part of the research, we did more of a quantitative approach. So we did surveys in a number of different communities, 8 different areas in our case study city of Peter Marisburg, and I'll just show you a couple of maps. So, I don't know if this is going to work. Maybe I'm not. Can you see it? Oh, outside, okay. Anyway, on the map you can see the arrow pointing to Peter Marisburg, which is the capital city of KwaZulu-Natal. It's not the largest city in the province. The largest city is Durban. More people might be familiar with Durban. But Peter Marisburg is the capital, and it has a very long history going back to the 19th century as an early colonial capital as well. So this early research then was quantitative in nature, looking at the different. So this is Mzanduzi municipality within the province of KwaZulu-Natal, and then these were our study sites for that first part of the research. So what we wanted to do was to go in and say, all right, look, people are coming into the city. This is rapidly urbanizing. There's a lot of low-income people. What kinds of housing, what kinds of neighborhoods, what kinds of areas are they settling in? And looking at the kind of range of opportunities for housing and establishing themselves in the city that there were. So we ended up looking at, as I say, 8 different wards, and this spanned the different types of neighborhoods or accommodation, from sort of squatter settlements or informal settlements, we call them in South Africa, to the new low-cost housing developments that the government was putting a lot of effort into, and I'm going to talk quite a bit about that, to older townships where there had been some, of course, legal African settlement in urban areas in South Africa. So some folks would just be moving in with relatives that were already there or building backyard shacks. And then there were also traditional peri-urban areas where this is really areas that were included or incorporated into the municipality post 1994 as a sort of expanded boundaries, but they're now officially part of the city, but they were there before as traditional areas, so that was another kind of. So we wanted to sample in all of those different areas and see, are there issues that come up, or can we compare the differences of things like health, environmental quality, what's going on in social life, economic life, and so on, across all these different types of areas that low-income people were residing. And could we make some conclusions about, for example, does the new government program of low-cost housing offer an improved situation for quality of life, improved health, improved environmental quality, and things like that. So that was the first phase. And interestingly, what came out of that was really not very many noticeable differences in those variables of health and sort of environmental quality. They were all bad, right? They were all bad. And so we felt that, okay, that doesn't seem to be the right question to ask them. It's not that people are experiencing differences because they're living in a different kind of house or because they're living in a different kind of neighborhood. But when we looked at the data from these surveys, the thing that jumped out over and over again was that on every single variable you would want to ask, whether it was economic status, employment status, health status, education, there was always a gender difference. Always a gender difference. And that particularly in relation to whether the house was headed by a female or headed by a male or jointly headed. So on all variables we looked at, we said, oh my goodness, okay. So then I realized that it was actually gender that was the story here. It wasn't necessarily housing, it wasn't necessarily environmental quality, it was gender that was driving the main differentiation we were seeing in low-cost populations in the urbanizing context. So then I went into a second phase of the project where I thought, all right, I have to understand women's lives in this urbanizing context, and then I went into an in-depth interviewing phase with female heads of households to find out, their history, how did they come to the city, what is their family life like, what are their relationships, what about employment opportunities, all of those kinds of things. So that's where we went next. So just to give you some pictures on these different contexts that I was describing, so just so you have a good idea of what we're talking about. So this is an example of the kind of older township kind of housing. You can see this is these places are electrified and have water, usually have waterborne sewage. And you know, these are more of a formal kind of opportunity for people to live in sort of relatively better kind of quality housing within urban areas. This is another example that we see. You can see here, again, I'm not sure where it's not really showing up very well, but on the right, there's kind of what we would call an informal dwelling, so made from traditional materials. This is, you know, wall and daub, we say in South Africa, or mud and poles. And so this particular place in Peace Valley 2, this was along main river that comes through the city. And in this case, it would have been, this would have been empty when people were starting to migrate into there in the late 80s, early 90s. And it's empty for a good reason. I mean, what would be that reason? You can think of it. Flooding, yeah, it's a flood zone. So, you know, the government had deliberately, you know, banned settlement or banned, you know, the development of residential areas or other kinds of buildings and so on there because of them being in the flood zone. So folks that are coming in this area in KwaZulu-Natal, a lot of people are fleeing, which was what was basically a civil war in that time between Ankata and ANC supporters. So a lot of them are rushing into the city to get away from that. They're looking for anywhere to stay, right? And so they find this vacant area and say, okay, well, I can build myself a house there. So, and then on the left, what you see happening is what we call in situ upgrading. So what's happening, they've arrived, they've made this very sort of informal, quick place to live, and they've done okay. So in cases like this, you can see, well, people have found opportunities. They have maybe started a small business or they've found a job. And they've developed, you know, they've earned enough money that they can now start building a more formal house. And so they're upgrading where they originally settled. I mean, there's still big concerns here, right? Because they're still in the flood zone. This is unofficial. The municipal government had not approved this site at the time that they were doing this building. But it is one of the kinds of contexts that you'll see in all over urbanizing South Africa, where people have decided they've squatted in an area that wasn't actually designated for housing, but they've decided to stay and they've invested and they've built up better housing. This is another sort of informal settlement into Tucaville. This area is very close to the central business district in the city, so a good place for people who are looking for economic opportunities in the city center. So again, this was a place that people had come in, I think in the early 90s originally, and started to settle and build these kinds of informal housing. They did win some battles against the government in the 90s, actually with some help from Canadian Oxfam and a local NGO. And they won the right to stay there, and the city actually brought in waterborne sewage. So folks there do have flush toilets for the most part, electrification and so on. But a lot of people are still unable to kind of reach that second phase of formalizing their housing, and the conditions are really quite bad. In that same area, when they brought in the waterborne sewage, some people had to be moved aside. And this, again, the local NGO, Basque Built Environment Support Group, which is a main housing NGO in the area, in partnership with Oxfam Canada, started a project, sort of a self-help project, where they taught the women, these were all mostly women who were displaced from the original settlement, to build their own houses. So it was one of these kind of women's empowerment kind of approach to housing, and women then were involved in building these houses. You can see on the right with the curved roof. Very, very beautiful, very, very decent, dignified housing situation there with this. So the women would learn how to pour cement and lay bricks and lay pipe and so on and so forth. And you know, part of that sort of empowerment kind of project idea is that women would then have these skills that they could then go on and market themselves to build other houses and so on. That didn't really happen as far as we could follow up with people that were involved, but still they ended up, in a very good place in terms of being close to the city center, as well as having rooms they could rent out, which is one of the main economic activities that female heads of household have success in, is renting out backyard shacks or extra rooms in their homes. So these women who were part of this kind of project actually were doing really quite well. But right next door to really quite deplorable shacks still in that same area. So you see some differentiation happening then too there in that example. This is the big story in South Africa, and have all of you been to South Africa, or have any of you been to South Africa? You have, okay. So one person, and you have to, yeah. Well, if you have, you will notice when you're driving around that all of the urban areas now have these kinds of new settlements popping up on the urban peripheries. And this is the big government-driven housing, low-cost housing program. This was rolled out or started right from 1994 as part of the Reconstruction and Development Program, or RDP. And this particular settlement in Pietermaritzburg, on the fringes of Pietermaritzburg, in its initial phase with 5,000 houses. So it gives you the sense of sort of the scale. And it's now actually gone on to be much bigger. I don't know, Mark, if you remember the numbers for the second phase, but so we're talking about thousands and thousands of homes. And this is a subsidized government program, very much part of how people understand Nelson Mandela's promise for a better life for all. People interpreted that to mean better living conditions, flush toilets, real housing, being able to live in the city, all of that kind of, and as such, these houses are often called Mandela Houses. They're small, 30-meter squared, sort of matchbox houses, built in some greenfield areas, so these could have been formerly farmlands that might have been abandoned or I guess acquired by municipal governments over time. And so they're developer driven, so these are not self-help, sweat equity kind of things. These are large scale contracts with developers who just come in and throw up these houses as fast as they can. So this is a really important part of the story because the majority of recipients of these are female heads of households. So there's a real gendered story here. Does anyone have any questions so far? Yeah.
The last point you mentioned, why are women head households main recipients?
Okay, so we'll get to that.
Okay.
Because it is a big part of the story.
Okay, great.
Okay, and I could just say like a couple more things about this. The government, of course, boasts on a regular basis about how many millions of houses it's built, and fulfilling its promise to the people in terms of delivering on housing and services. These are usually electrified. There's definitely running water. They don't always have flush toilets because of terrain and the difficulty and the expense of building the infrastructure, the sewage pipes and so on out in these peripheral areas. I mean, we have the same debates in Canada, right, about these new far-flung suburbs way out, how are we going to deliver services to those? So there's that kind of issue. In this particular case, which is called Ambleton, there's shale rock formations here. They have these on-site flush toilet systems that are supposed to drain into this shale, and it's just been a complete disaster. So a lot of the toilets here are not functioning anymore, and people have built latrines or they're dumping waste in vacant lots and this kind of thing. And the point I want to make there is that yes, the government can rightly say, yes, we've built 2 million houses or whatever, but what was the quality of that build? And we're already seeing really serious maintenance issues emerge in these new townships. So issues around the quality of the building materials for the walls and so on, so damp, and then water reticulation systems breaking down, and then of course the toilet systems as well. So the question then is, have we just built tomorrow's slums, right? Or tomorrow's ghettos in these areas that are already showing signs of problems? Yeah.
Did the toilet system work for a certain amount of time, or did it just?
Yeah, I'm sure they, I mean, we went out with the technicians when we first went into these areas, and, you know, they said, well, if they were used, well, the typical bureaucrat kind of speak, but, well, if they were used how they were supposed to be, they would work, right? And so that's sort of blaming the people, the users, for the breakdown. And there's all kinds of, you know, issues around poverty that have to be understood, is that, you know, people don't even buy real toilet paper because it's too expensive. So people might use old newspapers or whatever. So of course the toilets are going to get clogged. Of course, you know. But why did they design them to be so sensitive? So they weren't thinking about who the people were, what kind of conditions they live in, and so on when they put in these toilets. And you can see, I mean, you know, we're on a septic system ourselves. We know how much space a drainage bed needs. Look how close together these houses are. I mean, there's not even room, even if the land itself was absorbent and able to absorb the waste, there's not enough room for a proper septic kind of system. And they're not even septic tanks or anything. They were on site. I mean, it's just crazy. Cheap, right? Get it up, get it done. But it's definitely failing. Any other questions there? Want to move on? Yeah.
Did the massive infrastructure growth provide employment for women in that sector?
I know there was one special project or program where yes, there was some attempt to sort of have women business owners and that kind of thing, but in terms of labor, I don't recall seeing anything much about that. And remember, these are developer-driven things, right? So they would come in with their crews and they would just, you know, go through and do it. And sometimes, because it's a subsidy-driven system, there's a certain amount of money per house that's allocated. Sometimes that meant just the stand, you know, not even that building, the walls or anything, just the toilet and the foundation slab, and then people would come in and finish the job, recipients. So site and service, they call that, and they did that in the apartheid era as well. Yeah, so they would bring in part of it, whatever the subsidy allowed in that particular context, then the rest was left up to the recipient. And in this program, the recipients then are legal owners, so they're given title deeds even though they don't pay any money. So this is an interesting, you know, if you're really into housing and tenure and all that kind of stuff, that's actually really important, that these are not rented, they are actually become the property of the people who receive them. And South Africa has been given a lot of praise for this internationally, you know, looking at this in the context of the global urbanizing South. All over there's discussions about, well, how do we manage this rapid growth in urban areas, whether it's India or China or wherever, what kind of programs and policies, tenure arrangements and so on are the best to serve the poor. Anything else?
Sorry. Can you just clarify, so the developers, you would say that they come in, they kind of just do the foundations, and the owners would have to pay for the rest?
In some cases,
Okay.
not in this particular case, the houses were built,
Mm-hmm.
but I was just saying that in some contexts, maybe parts of the process cost more so that the subsidy didn't cover everything.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So now I just want to go through, so I mentioned that, and I'll show you a slide in a little bit that show these, the sort of data around all this gender differentiation that I was talking about, that when we looked at female-headed households compared to male-headed households, how they differed along all these different variables. So I'll show you the data on that. But now I just wanted to show you some of the various kinds of situations, family situations that the women that I interviewed in the second phase told us about. And you can just start to see the kind of range of families, the range of households, and how people are actually living in the city through looking at some of these different stories. So first of all, this was in Hamilton, so in that new low-cost development that we were just looking at, the field of homes. And so this was Mama P and her family and friends, so we interviewed Mama P. She's seated with the baby. And so one thing I would just talk about is how these households are female-centered. So when we talk about female-headedness, it emerged as the norm. So there were more female-headed households than there were male or jointly headed households in the low-income areas that we sampled. And when I looked at the national level data, it was true across South Africa. In urbanizing South Africa, low-income urban Black households are majority female-headed. So what does that mean? That means that female-headedness is normal, right? It's not a deviation. It's not the special case. It's not, a man is missing kind of thing, and therefore it's a deviation. So we really had to kind of grapple with that. What does this normal female-headedness mean, right? And when you start looking at the history in urban South Africa, we find that this isn't a new phenomenon. So when I looked back at anthropological studies and sociological studies from the 60s and 70s, they were already talking about this in urban contexts, that we were seeing large numbers of female-headedness. I think it's actually become more of a phenomenon than it was historically, but it was always there and very noticeable to researchers as they were looking at urbanizing South Africa. So it's normal, and I call it female-centered. So it's not only that there's a female head, there's often a whole kind of group of women involved in the way that this household is functioning, or this and the family is functioning. So it could be that there's a mother, she's got her sister living with her, they've got an elderly aunt perhaps, and then the daughters and the daughters' children. Often case two, there might be the missing middle. That's part of the legacy of AIDS and HIV, where the middle generation, the mother, so her age, she's in her 30s, Mama P, so her generation, they're not there. So you've got grandma, you've got grandchildren, you might have aunt. So it's this idea of women across generations, so multi-generational, and a number of different women kind of either residing together or living next door to each other, and this becomes really important in terms of social networks and how people actually help each other to survive. And in fact, this family here tells another story, which is, you see this, I don't think my dog is really showing up very well, but you see the baby here. He's the son of the girl standing up, okay? So, yeah, this isn't really good.
I think you also use the mouse point.
Well, that might be even more, yeah, then I'm not standing in front of it, okay, all right. So this is Mama P, this is her daughter, and this is her daughter's child, okay? So that's actually her grandson. He was not well, that baby. I suspect that he might have been positive, which it could very well mean that mom is positive. She's a teenager, right? So this is how the kind of this story of the missing middle might be starting here. Although of course now we do have better rollout of ARVs and so on and so forth. So hopefully they will get access to adequate treatment. But this is just an interesting sort of early point where we see that maybe this is going to emerge into a missing middle kind of grandmother-led household. This is another example. So this was the Peace Valley to the informal settlement along the river that I talked about. And in this case, CCS, she's 24 years old. Her grandmother was there, but she was dying. So she was inside and very, very unwell and couldn't function anymore. So CCS said, I'm the head. I'm the head of this household. I'm the one who's making decisions. I'm the one who's in charge and has to figure things out. And this was true even though her brother was also there. So it's interesting to see how the female-headedness seems to be quite normalized in terms of, okay, who's going to take charge here? And she was very strong in saying, no, that's me. It's going to be, I'm the one. I'm going to be the head. So in this case, she's a bit too old to say that it's a child-headed household, but this is also another form of household that we see as a sort of a legacy of the AIDS crisis. Is young people younger than that being left to kind of figure out what to do. Any questions on this kind of? Okay, so that's another example then of a different kind of situation. At the other end of the spectrum, Gogo, and Gogo just means grandmother in the South African context. Again, this is back up in the Ambleton in the low-cost subsidized housing development. And remember, these are 30 meters squared buildings. 19 people lived in that one house. So she was a really great grandmother because there were just a whole bunch of, or many layers of generations in this household. So it was her and her husband again, but she's the head, even though he was there. And then he wandered away and back and whatnot. But she said, no, she's in charge. And then a couple of her daughters, who were then grandmothers as well, and then great-grandchildren, and so on and so forth. And this kind of household really strongly illustrates how people actually cobble together income and livelihoods. Is they had several, maybe four different pensions. So in South Africa, there's old age pensions that people receive on a monthly basis. Women qualify at age 60, men at 65. So this particular house had several people over 60, and so they were, pooling together their old age pensions. They also had some child support grants, which is another welfare provision that South Africa provides. So children used to be under 14, but now it's under 18. All children the caregivers of those children are eligible for a child support grant. So this is how people in this context of extremely high unemployment are actually surviving, is by getting access to these welfare payments. And there were also many orphans, so sort of unrelated or maybe distantly related children there. And again, the first slide with Mama P, that was again part of her income generating strategy, is that she was looking after orphans, and that you could apply to the government to get child support grants for those children that she was looking after. So this is some of the ways that people are surviving. And this really illustrates what happens when you can't get access to a welfare grant. So in this case, so going again to another extreme, there were only 2 people in this RDP or Mandela House, Gogo S. She was 57, and her grandson, 14, was living with her. So again, a missing middle kind of situation there. She's too young for a pension. So she has no access to a pension, and she felt she was too old to work. She wasn't strong anymore, so she wasn't able to work. And so all they had was the one child support grant for her grandson. So they were really on the edge of destitution, really hungry. And people at this end do things like go around the neighborhood and ask people for a cup of meal, so they might have something to eat that day. And you can't really tell, because look how beautiful she is. She's got this home and the furniture and so on. So many aspects of her situation look like they're really quite decent, but they're really on the edge of destitution in this particular household. And this is another kind of situation that we saw a few times. So again, a grandmother looking after children and grandchildren. And I think in this case they did have child support grants were the main kind of income that was coming into the household. But she was really worried because her husband, who had run away with a younger woman or women many, many years ago, was now sick. And he found out that she got access to one of these Mandela houses on her own, in her own name, and now he wants to come back and get her to look after him. And so she was really, really worried about that. And how am I going to do this? It's going to ruin my life. Here I am building up my home and looking after my kids and grandkids. And this man who was so bad to me now wants me to look after him while he's sick. So we actually were able to put her in touch with legal aid to see if there was any kind of legal help that she could get in terms of making sure that didn't happen. And I mean, I don't know how much we're going to talk about this, but one of the big themes in the book is these fraught gender relations that we're finding in urbanizing South Africa. And so a lot of pain, a lot of really unhappy relationships, a lot of violence. And you know, one of the questions I'm asking in the book is this a social crisis? I mean, this is part of the story of the predominance of female-headedness, but it's also a much bigger story than that the gender relations are really such a disaster and so fraught and so difficult. You know, is that a social crisis? Another question is that a crisis of masculinity? I mean, some people write about that, and you know, what is gone wrong with gender relations and intimacy in South Africa. This other case illustrates something else I just wanted to underline. This was in Tutukuville, in that informal settlement that I was talking about, where some of the houses got, they built these new houses under the Women's Empowerment Program. But in this case, this is still an informal house. So this is an elderly grandmother, and she's looking after her one grandson, so there's 2 people in that household. And so they have the child support grant, and she has a pension. And others in the community also said, well, she also sells beer, but she didn't admit to that. So there's all kinds of other informal things that people might be doing. But I just wanted to emphasize there that she had never been to school. And this is one of the things that really shocked me, but it shouldn't have, knowing a little bit about the history of South Africa before I started it. But that a lot of people in that generation have no formal schooling. And it's just, it's shocking. Because when you're talking about an urbanizing and modernizing context, what do you do with that? I mean, how do you help people survive who aren't even literate, right? In negotiating this kind of new and making it kind of a vibrant and where are the economic opportunities for people who have no formal education? So it's actually a huge human capital issue in South Africa today. All right, so just a couple of slides with some of the data, just to so we've seen some of the stories illustrating some of the details of lives. But in terms of the data, in terms of the headships, I just wanted to point out. So overall, so this is in our first round of the survey work that we did in the 8 different wards. So overall, the bar on the far left, that's the whole sample. You can see that the blue bar is female-headed, so there were definitely significantly more female-headed households than there were jointly or male-headed households in our sample as a whole. But then you can look at the different neighborhoods and see some differences there too. The one right beside it, in Ambleton, shows the highest rate of female-headedness. Okay, so you can see that across the whole graph, that is where the neighborhood with the highest rate of female-headedness is the new low-cost development that the government is rolling out. And then when we looked at the national level data, we found that this was actually true across all of South Africa, that the majority of these new low-cost housing is going to female heads. We also see in the informal settlement, so Peace Valley, definitely more female-headedness there. Ash Road was another informal settlement being upgraded, or sorry, not being upgraded. Ash Road was another informal settlement, is more parity there, so we're seeing both male and female-headed households. And Bali was an older township area, so again, you see a little bit more parity. And then as you move out, those are the peri-urban traditional areas that I was talking about. We're still seeing more male-headedness emerge, as you would expect. These are traditional areas where people have lived there for generations, and older folks are still there with male-headedness. So more traditional kind of family situation. So you do see variations across these different places, but the big story really is that new low-cost housing emerging as a place where female heads are predominating. So that's really interesting. Anyone have any questions about that? And we could go back to your question now about why is that the case. And the reason that is not because the government is targeting female heads. So it's not sort of saying we want to give more to female heads. That's not the case. But it is a means-tested program. Because it's a welfare program. So that means that your income has to be at or below a certain maximum per month before you qualify to get one of these subsidized houses. So that means the poorest of the poor are going to more likely qualify. And as we know, female-headed households are usually poorer. So it's really kind of just I don't know what it's like, a default, I guess, in a way, that because there are more poor female-headed households, they are going to be more recipients of these subsidized housing. And the other story there too is that discrimination against female heads as homeowners was dropped. So historically, it was only male heads of households that were allocated for that older township houses in South Africa in the 1960s and 1970s. Women weren't allowed to own those houses. So all of that was gone, so there's no legal issues for women owning houses, and then out of their poverty and having dependent children differentially qualified them to receive these grants. Any other questions there? And just in terms of how the differentiation happens, so this is selected socioeconomic data comparing female-headed and other-headed households. So other-headed are either male or joint. Very few households said they were joint. It was either male or female, but there were a few. So this gives you a sense of the sort of scale of the differences between female-headed and male-headed. So the head is employed in the formal sector. So we found 22% of female heads were employed in the formal sector, but in other-headed households it was almost 40%. I mean, this is a huge difference. So you're seeing, this is where the differential poverty really resides, right? Is that more male heads are actually in formal employment and bringing more money into the household. The second one is the head is unemployed. 40% of female heads are unemployed, where only 24% of male heads are unemployed. So again, a huge difference in terms of the economic vulnerability. And then the third part of that is also really important. That the number of working age members of the household that are employed in the formal sector. So only 12% of people who could work in female-headed households are working, compared to 29% in other-headed households. And so this, again, means there's a much bigger dependency burden, too. So you've got more people who are not working in the female-headed, and more heads that aren't working. So, it's just this compounded economic marginality that we're seeing in these families. And that this just underlines, the next one is just about unemployed numbers. And then, third from the bottom, the head receives a welfare grant. 42% of female heads are receiving some kind of welfare grant. So that could be a pension, it could be a disability grant, it could be a child support grant. Only 17% of other-headed households are. So this is how those households are surviving, is on welfare. So that's the big story. I won't go through this, it's just more, because we were really interested in health, we were also looking at health differentiation. I mean, the main story here, well, there's a couple of points. It's more often that there's deaths in the household are pretty much the same, across both different households, kinds of households, but more people are dying at home in female-headed households than in others. So that means in other-headed households, people are dying in hospital, right? So the burden of care then is much higher when you have a sick person being cared for and dying at home in female-headed households. And the other, I guess, what was the other thing? Oh yeah, a school-aged child was more likely to stay home in a female-headed household as well, to look after that sick or dying. Right? So the issues of health and health care and burdens of care emerged very strongly as an extra struggle for female-headed households. Okay, so these are just some critical questions that the book as a whole tries to grapple with, and my approach was very much trying to start with these stories of women's lives. So, how did they come to the city? What are their families like? What are their struggles, their health, their livelihoods, and so on? And then trying to understand the implications of those lives for things like government policy, the macro environment of the economy in South Africa. So asking questions at the higher structural levels or higher levels of scale, but always having the questions come out of the women's lives. So that was very much my approach. So looking at the links from the macro or the micro to the meso level of institutions and government to the macro structures of economy and politics. So I talk quite a bit about that in the book, about the Constitution, about the welfare policies, about the legal situation, about the role and function of municipal government and service delivery and those kinds of things, and how does that relate to how these women are actually living their lives every day, and how does this impact on them. And I also, as I said earlier, wanted to grapple with this question of, is because of this predominance of female-headedness in urbanizing South Africa, is this a social crisis? And the disordered gender relations that are part of that story, is that a social crisis? I mean, does it matter that men are not part of the story here? Well, they are part of the story, but a negative part of the story. Should we be concerned about that? Should we be concerned about the high rates of dependency on state welfare for survival? What does that mean for stability of the country? What does that mean for women's understanding of their own identity and their political subjectivity? Is there a crisis of masculinity? What are men doing with their lives? How does this affect them, the fact that they aren't participating in family life, that they're estranged from their partners and their children? What does that mean for their identity and for their future as part of South Africa? And then what the role of the state, welfare, economic policies, the Constitution. So how well is the state responding to the reality of urbanizing lives for South Africans? And then the book as a whole tries to understand this context of urbanizing South Africa within the right to the city framing device. And that's really meant to try and compare the situation in South Africa to the broader issues of the urbanizing global South. So how do we understand what's happening in terms of that globally as well? So I think that's all my remarks. So, this is a beautiful portrait of one of the women that we interviewed, done by my daughter, who's an amazing artist, Jennifer. Someday we were thinking of doing an actual exhibition, if she was going to do a bunch of paintings from this work, but then she had a baby and things kind of got off the rails. So we got one painting done, but this is still a future project. And I'd just like to acknowledge all these folks. Yeah. And really, I think that's all I'll say for now. I have no idea what I have said, because when one is in these kind of projects and talks about them from time to time, I don't know if I've missed big things that I should have said or whatever, but maybe we can just go back to that portrait and open the floor and hear what people have questions or comments, rude remarks. Yep. Okay.
Great. Then thanks, Allison. We'll start with a question. Pablo?
Yeah, thank you.
So maybe could you identify yourself?
Yeah, good idea. Yeah, so I'm Pablo, and I teach the Geography and Environmental Studies department
Oh, okay,
here at
great.
Carleton. And Pablo Mendes. And thank you for your presentation. Very interesting project. I'm also interested in housing questions, so I was taking a lot of notes. But my question is more about what do you think, or what do you find? What's the story with men? Where are they? What are they doing? Are they? Yeah.
Yeah. No.
And I'll add one more question.
Yeah.
Like different, kind of more of a demographic question. But are there many households that are made up of people living alone, or people are living together? Are they considered a household, or how I counted for those statistics that
Yeah.
I